Hello, today I'm going to talk about the paper review I'm looking, and my topic is on assessing the Fed insight from the Fed's monetary policy framework review. And here's the agenda that I'm going through. First, I'm going to give a background of the review and then identify the challenge that it has. And then I'm going to talk about the paper that's in the review, and finally, I will have the insights. And let's get started with some background on the Federal Reserve 2020 monetary policy framework. In August 2020, the Fed introduced a major shift in how it approaches two key goals. One is to maximize employment, and the second is the price stability. It was the first comprehensive policy framework review the Fed had ever conducted, and it came after years of unusually low inflation and interest rate following the 2008 financial crisis. One of the most important challenge was the adoption of something called flexible average inflation targeting. Instead of treating 2% inflation as a hard ceiling, the Fed would now allow inflation to run moderately above 2% for some times, especially after a period when it had been precedently low. The framework also placed greater emphasis on employment, specifically on avoiding shortfalls from maximum employment rather than reacting on both overshoot and undershoot. It was the subtle but important shift, recognizing that a strong labor market brings forward inclusive benefits. Another standout feature of the review was the public engagement process. Through an initiative called Fed Listen, policymakers gather input from a wide range of forces, including labor advocates, community group, and business leaders. They have a better understand how monetary policy affect people's life. So, in summary, the 2020 framework aimed to make policy more responsive to real-world conditions in signally a more patient, employment-focused, and transparent Federal Reserve. However, as we will see later, this approach was not without its drawback, especially when inflation made a strong comeback in 2021. And next, I'm going to identify the challenge in this framework. The framework's biggest flaw was that it was designed for a world that no longer existed. It was built during a decade of low inflation, so it was not well suited for an environment where inflation rose rapidly due to pandemic-related shock and supply constraint. And another challenge was that the Fed used a forward guidance and then other communication tools. These were intended to provide transparency and anchor market expectation, but in reality, they ended up being too rigid, leaving little room to respond when conditions change faster than expected. And finally, there was a growing gap between what the Fed expected and what actually happened. A side-by-side comparison of projects versus real inflation clearly showed that the Fed model failed to anticipate the surge, which further eroded public confidence in this response. And next, I'm going to talk about the paper that is in this review. There are 3 papers in total, but I chose one of them to emphasize the importance. Let's now look at the paper by Christiana and David Romer. Their paper asks a simple but critical question. Did the Fed 2020 framework actually make it harder to fight inflation? The rumors argue that the framework was too focused on the past, specifically the low inflation environment after 2008 crisis. So when inflation surged in 2021, the Fed tools and mindset were not ready. A major issue they raise is the emphasis on employment shortfall rather than the symmetrical deviations. This means that the Fed prioritized job recovery even as inflation data start to spike, leading to a delayed response. They also point out that the Fed may not treat their own framework too rigidly, as it is what a rule book, not a flexible guide. That rigidity made the Fed slower to adjust the course. As they wrote in the paper, the Fed's new framework likely contribute to a delay in responding the rising inflation by shifting the focus away from inflation risk and toward employment shortfalls. So in short, even though the framework was designed with a good intention, but did not hold up when economic conditions change rapidly, and is the key lesson moving forward. And finally, here's are some takeaway or the lesson that I learned from the review. First, it's clear that the Federal Reserve framework was a bold and thoughtful effort. It reflects lessons learned from a decade or of inflation and slashy recovery, and it aimed to make policy more inclusive and employment focused. It was a meaningful shift, but at the same time, the framework showed how even well-designed policy can struggle when the future does not look like the past. The Fed was slow to adjust when inflation spiked, partly because it was operating under assumption that no longer applied. One big lesson is the importance of flexibility. A framework must allow for clear direction, but also be adaptable when unexpected shock like a global pandemic and supply chain hit the economic. And secondly, communication tools like the forward guidance are very powerful, but they also carry risk if they lock policymakers in. The Fed credibility is built not just being transparent, but also being responsive. And finally, what I take away from the review from this paper is that policy framework are not just one-time fixes. They need to evolve continuously, inform both an economic shift and the policy outcome as they produce. Moving forward, I think the Fed will need to be more agile, balancing its employment goals with a faster and more decision response to inflation, and it may mean rethinking how rigid or symmetric future framework it should be. And that's enough of my presentation. Thank you.